welcome on behalf of the American Red Cross and our International Humanitarian Law Program here at National Headquarters in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to attend this really great webinar. It's our first celebrating the 75th anniversary of the signing of the Geneva Conventions of 1949. And we're honored to have a special guest with us today, not a stranger to us, but a scholar on the topic that we're here for today, Randy Bagwell. Randy serves as the Senior Director of the Red Cross Service to the Armed Forces, Europe, Middle East, and Africa divisions. He served over 35 years in the United States Army as an infantry officer and a judge advocate. I'll say as an aside, I was privileged to serve alongside then Colonel Bagwell. He deployed twice to Afghanistan and once to Iraq. Colonel Retired Bagwell has taught IHL to soldiers, commanders, and the public in over 20 countries at the International Institute of Humanitarian Law, the United States Naval War College, and the Army Judge Advocate General School, where he also served as dean. He's twice testified before the Human Rights Commission in the United States House of Representatives on IHL-related issues. Randy, I know it's a little bit later in Europe, but I want to thank you for joining us, and I'll hand off the reins to you.
Thank you, Thomas. And thank all of you for joining today. For those of you who are used to attending the American Red Cross IHL presentations, you're used to some amazing and entertaining slideshows that weave in pop culture and IHL. Unfortunately, that's not going to be the case today. Today, you're only going to be able to hear me talk. Gosh, I hope I don't start seeing the participant count go way down. But if that's okay, I'd like to do that because what I want to talk to you today is both, my viewpoint on the Geneva Conventions and the relevancy, but I want to talk about it in both a real personal context. So before I jump into the question of the day, which is, are the Geneva Conventions relevant 75 years old? I want to give you just a quick overview of my background and why I hope that I'm at least minimally qualified to talk to you about it today. So first, my first experience with Geneva Conventions was when I enlisted as an infantry soldier in the United States Army Reserves at 17. And as a private, my sergeants didn't spend a lot of time talking about the actual Geneva Conventions, but rather they taught me what is called the soldiers' rules, which at the time were 10 rules that were drawn from the Geneva Conventions and the principles they embody that we needed to know as frontline soldiers. Things like if you capture a prisoner, you're responsible for that prisoner's safety from that moment on. After a few years, I attended Officer Candidate School, OCS, and became a second lieutenant, also as an infantry officer. And during my officer training, again, no one really talked to me much about the details of the Geneva Conventions. They taught us, again, rules and principles that we were going to draw on, and as we applied. It may be a little unnerving to think about people going out, both enlisted soldiers and officers going out to fight wars, and they haven't even talked in great detail about these sort of amazing documents that guide combat. And yet, in many ways, they're based on principles, and we're able to draw from that. So in retrospect, it was a pretty good way to do it because the Geneva Conventions have 429 articles, and each of those articles have several sub-paragraphs with rules. All of them, again, are morals and principles based, and a soldier, as long as they know those underlying principles, he or she can generally get the answer right without knowing the details and the wording of the specific rules. So after I finished law school, I joined the Army full-time as a legal advisor and a member of the Judge Advocate General's Corps, what they often call a JAG. For the first time, I actually got into the specifics of Geneva Conventions. And then during my 30-plus years as a JAG, I had the opportunity to advise U.S. military officers and officers from other countries on the Geneva Conventions. I taught these rules in peacetime and applied them to 2 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. And I advise investigation into whether the rules have been violated and help make decisions on whether to take people to court who may have violated the rules. And I had the privilege of teaching these conventions and other aspects of IHL, international humanitarian law, at various points in my career in the US and in other countries. I say all this to just point that my knowledge of the conventions doesn't just come from being a soldier or an academic or a humanitarian that I am now with the Red Cross. It comes from a combination of all of these experiences, and it shaped how I see them and how I view them and how I'm impressed by them. So, what are the conventions? And before we get too far ahead, we ought to at least talk about the Geneva Conventions and give you just a little thumbnail sketch of how they came about. Well, the first Geneva Convention dates back to 1864. And in a nutshell, it sought to protect the sick and wounded soldiers on the battlefield and to identify medical personnel. For the first time, it established a single emblem at which to identify medical personnel so soldiers who were wounded could easily find them. That emblem, the Red Cross, paid homage to the Swiss, the Swiss businessman Henri Dunant, who was the one that established this idea and worked to bring about the first convention. So the Swiss cross, as many of you will know, at least that from maybe the pocket knife, but is it's a white cross on a red background. And so in honor of that and the founding, and it became a red cross on a white background. Often we get questions about, did it have anything to do with religion? The answer is it doesn't. It just had to do with honor of the Swiss. So that convention was updated a few times in 1906 and again in 1929. And then finally, the Geneva Conventions, as we know them, took their final shape in 1949. So we say conventions with an S because in 1949, it was no longer just one document, it was four. So the first is for the protection of the sick and wounded in the field. So think armies, and at the time, most of the armies considered the Air Force as part of the army. The sick and shipwrecked at sea was number two. Prisoners of war was number three, protection, and then number four was for protection of civilians in armed conflict. So we think of them, I really do, as soldiers, sailors, prisoners, and civilians is a way of kind of keeping up with the four. But none of these four conventions addressed how to fight, not the rules on how to fight. They were more focused on protecting those who were not in the fight, generally thought of as civilians, or who were no longer in the fight, people who were too sick, too wounded to be in the fight anymore, or who had already been captured. There were other treaties that addressed fighting. And then in 1977, a lot had changed. There was a lot of different kind of wars, different kind of fighting that was going on. I want you to, if you're, mostly it's Americans on this video, so think about that from Vietnam. Think about sort of these non-state type wars. And so they came up with some additional protocols. The first is Additional Protocol 1, as it's known as, dealt with international armed conflict. And it not only supplemented the Geneva Conventions with some new protections, it also wrote in some of the previous written rules of how to fight a war. And it was considered to apply to international armed conflict, that is, one country fighting another country or countries, but not these armed groups. That was covered in what's called non-international armed conflict. So that's when you think of non-international armed conflict, that's what's in Additional Protocol 2. And it's just usually an armed group fighting a country. So we often think of these as civil wars, like the U.S. Civil War. Not one country fighting a very large armed group from the South. So we had these two new additional protocols. One with some new ideas that were incorporated. That's Additional Protocol 1. And then the other with ideas on non-international armed conflict. But both were pretty radical. So while the Geneva Conventions themselves have what we refer to as universal ratification, every country in the world at the time agreed to them, signed and ratified them, bringing them into law. That's not the case for Additional Protocol 1 and 2. In fact, the U.S. has signed both, but not ratified them, meaning that the U.S. is not bound by these, although the U.S. widely follows most of the rules that's in it. So it just we'll talk about later about how difficult it is to get the world together to decide on new rules. So we're talking about this. There is one common article, again, that is, without getting into details about the Geneva Conventions, there's a few articles, 1, 2, 3 are in all 4 conventions in identical wording. They're referred to as common articles. And common article 3 is very basic. It's about 3/4 of a page, and it just describes in the Geneva Conventions how to treat people in international and non-international armed conflicts. So when it's not state on state, country on country fighting. Okay, look, we could, I love history and I love the conventions, so we could talk about this all day, but I don't want to do that. I want to jump right into the question that is, do the Geneva Conventions at 75 years old still matter? So of course, before answering that question, one might ask the question, why are we even, questioning the relevancy? Why are we asking if they matter? Because they were ratified by every single country in the world. They have universal application. As I saw in the beginning slide, some of you may have seen it, and then the 75 years on for the Geneva Convention, the quote was, one set of rules that we all agree on. And so I think that is a Geneva Convention. So what's changed? Why are we questioning the relevancy now? Well, I would say the most significant thing that's changed is that wars of the past 20 years have predominantly, not exclusively, predominantly been non-international. So in a strict technical sense, nothing in the Geneva Conventions except for Common Article 3 applied. So they, because they haven't explicitly in detail in their full body applied to these non-international armed conflicts, where we've seen terrible outrages committed on people and the Geneva Conventions might have otherwise protected, there's a feeling that by some that they failed and that they're not relevant anymore in the time we live in. So just for a lot of you that haven't really thought about it much, the U.S. in the what was referred to as a global war on terror, but we were in Afghanistan, and that was determined to be a non-international armed conflict. The U.S. wasn't fighting a known government at the time, at least not one they recognized. They were fighting armed groups, the Taliban and Al Qaeda. And then when the U.S. went to Iraq shortly after 2003, for a brief moment, it was an international armed conflict when it was fighting the government forces of Iraq. But very soon into that conflict, the government went away. The U.S. sort of took over, and its coalition partners took over, and then they stood up a new government of Iraq, and that force, and then combined, the partners, the U.S. and the new government forces all fought an insurgency as well. So that became a non-international armed conflict. So you look at it, the lives of thousands of people being affected, the deaths of thousands of people, and you're like, the Geneva Conventions didn't even technically apply. Why are they relevant today? We're going to get into, I got 6 reasons, but I'll cut to the chase real quick. Do I think they're relevant? Absolutely. 100%, resoundingly unequivocal, I think they're relevant. So let me give you the 6 reasons and why I think they matter and why they're relevant today, even if we continue to fight mostly non-international armed conflicts. So I'll start with the 2 reasons that people bring up the most. And the first is what I just touched on, that the conventions don't have application in what are mostly the modern conflicts of today, these non-international armed conflicts. The second is that why should we, one side, follow the rules when the other side doesn't? Isn't that trying to, fight with an unfair fight, in that fight with one hand tied behind your back. So let's talk a little bit more about the application to today's fights. Well, it's true that most armed conflicts of the past 20 years have been non-international armed conflicts. And these conflicts, the Geneva Conventions don't technically apply. There's no certainty that that will continue in the future. So humans have a long history of proving that they are very poor predictors of what the next conflict will be and when it will occur. In fact, we tend to just think that whatever we're experiencing in the moment will continue forever. But we know that's not true, as history has shown us. One of the things that when I think about this is I remember what they were saying about World War I at the end. It was referred to as the Great War, the war to end all wars. We were never going to go to war again. That proved to be false. And within just 20 years, the span of 20 years, again, the countries of the world would be fighting each other on a global scale in World War II. So while non-international armed conflicts have dominated the past 20 years, we've recently seen the war going on in Ukraine, a state-on-state international armed conflict that demonstrates that international armed conflicts are not just a relic of the past. And in these conflicts, such as the one going on currently in Ukraine, the full bodies of the Geneva Conventions apply. So even if the majority of armed conflicts continue to be non-international in the future, the Geneva Conventions provide a really good starting point for what rules should apply, even if we're applying them by analogy, and a set of rules. They also are a set of rules in which militaries can train during peacetime. So what does that mean? Every detail of every detail of Geneva Convention 3, which is the Convention on the Prisoners of War, it doesn't have to be followed to the letter in non-international armed conflicts. But much of the spirit, the way you would treat the humanity embodied in it, much of the spirit of those specific rules can be applied by analogy, since they're based in humanity and in basic human values. So even though you're going to say, well, technically we don't have to do the certain letter by letter, rule by rule that's contained in that, we can certainly apply most of the rules by analogy. The second thing is that training. So prior to 2001, the US government had a policy that said, even in conflicts in which the Geneva Conventions do not technically apply, we will still apply the most of the Geneva Convention by analogy and actually by the rules. We train all the rules. That's how we're going to treat people. So, for example, how they would treat a prisoner of war, we're not going to say that the policy wasn't that we would give them prisoner of war status under the convention, but we would give them prisoner of war treatment. So we're going to treat them not as some other thing, but as if they were a prisoner of war. That was our policy. And for much of my early career as a soldier, that's what we trained on, and that's what I believed to happen. Even my early days, my first few years as a legal advisor, as a JAG, that's what we trained. It's what I trained soldiers on, and it's what I believe would happen. And then in 2002, I deployed to Afghanistan. And while in Afghanistan, our government issued a guidance that said, we're not going to apply the Geneva Conventions to this conflict. And while it's technically right, it left the question in my mind, well, if not these rules, then what rules? Because we had only trained on the Geneva Conventions. At the time of that conflict, when I was there, I was a major, and I was a senior legal advisor to a two-star general in combat operations. I mean, we're taking prisoners and we're killing people. I mean, what was I supposed to say when he asked me as his legal advisor, like, what rules apply? Because the guidance we had been given was that we're not going to apply the Geneva Conventions, but we didn't give us a new set of rules that we're substituting. So what did that, for me, it felt our entire military was kind of adrift, trying to figure out in the middle of combat operations what rules applied. And in my opinion, not only was it a terrible way to fight a war, it was a recipe for human rights violations, for legal violations, and for ultimately things and actions that turned America as a country, I think, down a dark path that led to government-sanctioned torture. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as to how it got there. But the much of what we saw when not knowing how to do this led to things like enhanced interrogation techniques, a very clean way of talking about things that we have subsequently ruled out as torture. So the second argument that I hear is probably the one I hear most often from soldiers, is that look, if the enemy doesn't follow the rules, why do we follow them? And I clearly understand why they say this, right? But in my opinion, that's very short-sighted. We don't follow the rules because the other side follows the rules. We follow the rules because they're reflective of the values that make us who we are as Americans, as humans. War is not a sporting event where your team, the fouls are called against this team and you get upset because the other team is playing dirty and nothing happens. And, despite hearing all the time on like ESPN and other sports, articles where somebody says, yeah, me and my guys, we're going to war this weekend, and they're talking about playing a game. We're not asking our men and women to go to war and play a game. We're asking our soldiers to go and kill other humans on our behalf, on behalf of our nation. We ask them to commit truly inhumane acts while expecting them to be able to return home with their own humanity intact. We don't follow the rules because the other side does. We follow the rules because they reflect who we are as a nation. And they're the only way, I believe, our service members can face the horrors of war and hope to return human. I think President Abraham Lincoln understood this when, in the fall of 1862, he asked a guy named Francis Lieber, a Prussian immigrant who was a law professor. He asked him to draft some rules. This was on the eve of the Battle of Antietam in Maryland. And in just one day, the U.S. combined, North and South, one day had over 23,000 casualties. It's the bloodiest single day on American soil in U.S. history. Because of the success, the South had to leave, but they fought this battle kind of to a standstill. And they did withdraw from the field, leaving it to the Union forces. But it was, by many people, considered a victory for the Confederate forces. And because of this success, England and France were very close to entering on the side of the South. And had they done so, it likely would have tipped the entire outcome of the war to their favor. If you look at what a lot of historians have written about this time, there is no other time in the history of our nation where the United States has been in such danger of ceasing to exist. We have never in our days experienced darker days. Yet at this time, during our darkest days, when the very existence of the country hung in the balance, President Lincoln authorized Francis Lieber to draft a set of rules on how to fight for the Union forces. These rules would govern how they fought the rest of the war, not because they would help the North win the war, not because the South had also agreed to follow them, but because President Lincoln believed they reflected the values and the very essence of what it meant to be an American. The Union forces, as we know, no spoiler alert here, but the Union forces ultimately were successful in the war. And for the next 50 years, General Order Number 1 is what has also been called the Lieber Code, became the set of rules that the American military would follow. Even through World War I, it almost verbatim stayed intact. And much of the language from that Libra Code can still be found in the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols today. Allowing ourselves to mirror the inhumane behavior of the enemy does not level the playing field. Well, I mean, I guess in one sense it does. It brings all of us down to their level. It brings us down to the very bottom of humankind, and it makes us and our actions just as inhuman as they are and their actions are. So this leads me to my third point as to why the Geneva Conventions are just as important today. They strengthen the resiliency of our fighting men and women, and they help them reintegrate back into normal society once the fighting is over. And to a lesser degree, but still just as important, I think they strengthen the resiliency of our entire nation in the same way. So despite having not been in court in many years, I still consider myself a courtroom lawyer at heart. And when I was in court, one of the things I like to think about and to use to help juries understand concepts was analogies. So I'm gonna use an analogy here as well. I served for 2 years with the Army in Alaska. It's the only place I grew up in Arkansas, in a southern state. So Alaska was the only place I ever lived where I personally experienced a blizzard. And in some of the remote places where people, were kind of out by themselves before a blizzard, they would string ropes between certain buildings they had to get to, maybe a building that had livestock, maybe a building that had firewood, so that during the storm, they wouldn't get lost. They could find their way back between things as long as they held on to the rope. War is like the blizzard of inhumanity, right? Our nation is going to ask young women and men to go kill other humans. I hope no one on this call has had to think about really having to go kill another human. But I can tell you from personal experience, it isn't like the movies. It's horrible. It's nasty. It's smelly. It's dirty. It's loud. Killing another human being is something that fortunately, most people will never have to do. But it's also something that unfortunately, those who've had to do it will likely never forget. I don't believe that humans are really programmed to go kill other people. I think killing another human is not natural to anyone. It's actually considered in almost every legal, every society, it is considered both legally and morally wrong, and is usually the worst punishment, the worst crime you can commit in any legal code out there in the world. It's hard, believe it or not, it's hard to get soldiers to kill another person, even when it's necessary and legal for them to do so. I've even had a commander wanting to know, could he punish a soldier for not shooting at another person, an enemy, when that soldier should have shot at them or could have. It's hard to get them to do it. And for a few people, it's equally hard to get them to stop once they've experienced that power over life and death. In a sense, we're giving the power of God to 18-year-olds, soldiers, the power to decide who lives and who dies. And with that power should come great responsibility. As I was in my officer training as an infantry lieutenant, I had to read a book called The Platoon Leader. It's written by a colonel at the time that wrote it, Colonel James McDonough. He's a retired officer, but he was writing about his experience as a young platoon leader leading his platoon in Vietnam. And I could not say it better, this part better than him. So I want to just share this short passage, because even after 30 plus years, it still resonates with me. He said, I had to do more than keep them alive. I had to preserve their human dignity. I was making them kill, forcing them to do the most uncivilized of acts, but at the same time, I had to keep them civilized. That was my duty as their leader. They were good men, but they were facing death, and men facing death can forgive themselves many things. War gives the appearance of condoning almost everything, but men must live with their actions for a long time afterwards. A leader must help them understand that there are lines they must not cross. He is our link to normalcy, to order, to humanity. If a leader loses his own sense of propriety or shrinks on this duty, anything will be allowed and anything can happen. War is at its very core the absence of order. And the absence of order leads very easily to the absence of morality, unless a leader can preserve each of them in their place. The leader has to set the standard for morality as clearly as he sets the standard for personal hygiene and weapons maintenance. He must allow no cutting of corners. A bottle of soda stolen from an old peasant woman leads gradually but directly to the rape of her daughter if the line is not drawn from the beginning. I think that really sums up a lot of the blizzard of war. The war is the blizzard that our fighting men and women must go through, where they're going to be asked to commit those uncivilized acts, to commit inhuman and uncivilized acts. The rope that we can follow through the storm is the Geneva Conventions, and we string that rope with the training that we do in peacetime. Then we hold on to it during the storm, during the war, and we follow it through. If we let go, we run the risk of being lost and never finding our way back. But if we hold on to the rope, we can get through the storm and reach the other side with our own humanity intact. So what can they do? What can the conventions do? They can do for our service members by guiding through the storm. And when I'm asked the question, why should we follow it when the other side doesn't? I would say, when you have something so powerful, something that is so meaningful to our side, who cares if the other side follows the rules? The battle isn't theirs. The battle is for our own psyche and our own mental health, not theirs. So there's a concept gaining some relevancy, and it's even been recognized last couple of years by the Veterans Administration, called moral injury. And moral injury comes, especially for service members, it can happen in other cases, but it comes for service members when a person perpetrates, witness, or fails to act to prevent, perpetrates, witnesses, or fails to prevent acts that transgress the person's own moral beliefs, values, or ethical code. One of the authors that wrote on this has described it as a deep soul wound that pierces a person's identity, sense of morality, and relationship with society. One way to prevent, or at least reduce the impacts of moral injury, is to arm our service members with the rules that ground them in our shared values. And the reason it can do this is because if they can accept that what the conventions embody is a moral code, is a moral values-based rules, then we can ask them to do terrible things, but it doesn't violate their own sense of it doesn't transgress their own moral beliefs and values. So it can be a huge sort of prophylactic effect on what they come back with. During World War II, there were certainly atrocities committed by both sides, and then after the war, the most serious offenders from the losing side were famously tried at Nuremberg, but there were also trials held in Tokyo. I'm not going to suggest, nor do I want to start the debate that the atrocities committed by the winning countries compared to those on the losing countries, that's a discussion really for another day. But clear to say, both sides had their own sort of issues and atrocities committed. One brief example for those who may not be as well on the U.S. side is the U.S. firebombed cities in Japan, killing thousands, hundreds of thousands of innocent people many of whom were children. In fact, the fire bombings in Japan killed more people, it's estimated, killed more people than both of the atomic bombs put together. At the time, the U.S. general leading that bombing campaign was a general by the name of Curtis LeMay. And Curtis LeMay actually told his wife that, and this was during the war, what was going on, that if the U.S. were to lose, he fully expected to be tried and hung for his part in the firebombing. So, you know, there again, I'm not going to judge the actions of that then. I just want to put it in context for the next statement I'm going to make. So why is that little aside relevant to this discussion? So my opinion, the war crime trials following World War II was what the winning side did for the losing side. It recognized the horrors they had done. What did the winning side do for themselves? I would submit to you that they drafted the Geneva Conventions of 1949. They wanted to ensure they recognized what they had done, and they weren't going to put themselves on trial, but they recognized it, and they wanted to ensure that future generations didn't do the same mistakes, didn't do the same things they did. They didn't want future generations to have to live with the acts that they had to live with. In World War II, briefly, they let go of the rope, and they wanted to ensure that future generations didn't. I talked about this a few minutes ago, but I'll just expound a little bit. But in 2002, the United States also briefly let go of the rope. We had just been attacked on September 11th, 2001, and the Justice Department authored a memo declaring the Geneva Conventions did not apply to the fight against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. While this determination may have been technically correct, it unmoored the conduct of the U.S. government and its armed forces from the policies and training that they have followed for years. And it set us adrift. I say us because at the time I was a soldier. It set us adrift in uncharted waters without proper rules and training. And this led directly to the enhanced interrogation techniques that ultimately led to and resulted in outright torture. Sometimes one can be technically correct, but still morally wrong. And when we lose our moral footing, we can easily lose ourselves. And a set of rules like the Geneva Conventions can help us stay on the right path. So the third thing, you probably wonder how long is it going to take? But the third thing is that no one is ever punished, right? Do they even have a deterrence effect? Does anybody ever get punished with these rules? So let me give you an analogy, because I like to think a lot of times when I describe legal concepts, for some reason, I can think of them in terms of traffic laws. Let's talk for a minute about speeding in the United States. Most people who speed are not punished. So I want you to ask your question, do the speeding laws of the United States actually make a difference? Most people who speed are not punished, but knowing that the law exists and that there's a chance that they might be punished causes most people to modify their behaviors. If there were no speed limits, people would just drive as fast as they want, and the death rate would climb from accidents. So it isn't just the fear of keeping, people don't violate it just to follow the rules, and it's not completely the fear that they're going to get caught every time. But most people still speed in the U.S., right? They just don't grossly speed. They don't go over. So, in fact, if the speed limit was 55 and most of you were driving 57 and you were pulled over and issued a ticket, you would be upset, like you're only going 2 miles over. Now, even in that statement, you're admitting you're technically violating the law, but you're like, what's going on? But you were routinely, you don't feel like you're a bad person for going 2 miles over. And sometimes, at least I have, maybe all of us, have gone more than 2 miles over. Maybe we go 10. We're really hurry for some reason. Maybe we've gone 15 over. We would understand a bit more if we got caught with that. But we might think that we're, not doing right. I kind of get it. But we wouldn't go 30 or 40 miles over the speed limit. I mean, that even that's such a gross conduct that we wouldn't do it. So the speed limit has some effect on us. But let's face it, the speed limit laws are not 100% enforced, but they still have a deterrent effect. Now, if we did want to, if we wanted to invest enough money on police and things and to capture every single speeder, we could, but the courts would be backed up. They'd have to be expanded. Police departments would do little but just catch speeders until they, increase their size to be enormous, just catch speeders. And we would lose flexibility in a system where deterrence already works pretty well. So I say that analogy because IHL is kind of like that. The conventions and violations of them is kind of like that. They aren't a set of laws that are designed to catch and prosecute every single offender. And while not everyone is caught and prosecuted, the worst offenders often are. And that's enough to get most people to follow the laws. Now, they don't follow every bit, just like you don't do the 2 miles over. Like there's little violations here and there. They might do something. And occasionally, though, even those people might be held accountable in some way. But they are enough to prevent and deter the gross violations. Now, there are those who feel that IHL is never enforced, but typically those people haven't really looked at it over time. And it's true, while not everyone is prosecuted, certainly not for minor offenses, but it's almost certain that some are, well, it is certain that some are prosecuted. And what I would also say is that we have to remember that almost no one is prosecuted while a conflict is ongoing. And I think that's where most people see is like, well, there's this thing going on right now, a conflict going on right now in this country, in this place, and violations are happening every day, and nothing's being done about it. So, you have to look at the history. Like the war crime trials of World War II, they didn't take place until after the wars were over. Then there's been some trials out of Kosovo, out of the Bosnia-Herzegovina conflict, and those took place after the conflict. So we know that there's no IHL police who can just show up in war and swoop in and grab people. States can and are obligated to charge their own fighters who violate the law. But to charge enemy fighters, you often have to wait until the conflict is over when you can actually get your hands on them. And that can take years. So this concept of the Geneva Conventions don't matter because the other side doesn't follow the rules or they're not enforced, really, it's without merit. So the conventions, the other aspect is they further humanity in armed conflict. And what is that? Have we already talked about that? Unlike what some Americans I've heard say to me, the Geneva Conventions are not rules created by Europeans to make the United States weaker, nor are they rules imposed by the weak on the strong. They're values-based principles that are found in all cultures of the world, and in almost every religious system of the world has some war-fighting rules. The Quran, the Bible, almost all of them have rules concerning protecting innocent people, sparing prisoners, and caring for those who are injured. These are not just some recent Western ideas or Judeo-Christian ideas. They're universal ideas, and they've been around for thousands of years, and they're ideas that resonate with all of the people of the world. They reflect humanity, and humanity is universal. They're not, those who don't recognize the rules in the Geneva Conventions as having, reflecting humanity, have perhaps already lost their own connection to humanity. Maybe at some point they let go of the rope and are now lost in the storm. Abandoning our shared values of humanity is one way in which people lose what it means to be human and allows them to actually commit not just acts of war, but monstrous acts. The Geneva Conventions are a product of the horrors of war from the original convention in 1864 to the current version in 1949, it took terrible events and horrific tolls on people to bring the governments together for this idea that something must be done. And every single country in the world has signed and ratified the Geneva Conventions in 1949, giving them global application. I think it's difficult to even imagine an event with such terrible global consequences that the world would unite again to create the replacement for the Geneva Conventions. Even in attempts to update them in the forms of the additional protocol, they haven't been nearly as widely accepted. For example, as I mentioned earlier, the US has only signed but not ratified the additional protocols 1 and 2, meaning we're not bound by those major updates. The conventions of 1949 have clearly become dated in some regards. For example, when I think about the Geneva Convention on Prisoners of War, there's a specific part in it that says if you force a prisoner to work, which you can as long as they're enlisted, you have to pay them 8 Swiss francs a month. I know anybody that's been, to Switzerland in the last 10 years would know that 8 Swiss francs today might, and I do say might, buy you a cup of coffee. So to think 8 Swiss francs a month is ridiculous. So there's places where it has clearly become dated and needs an update. But still, overall, the conventions have held up extraordinarily well to be 75 years old. And they still bring humanity to the inhumane act of war. So my final point that I'll throw out for you on the relevance of the conventions is their part in post-conflict reconciliation. So wars involve death, destruction, and really unimaginable personal loss. They never end well. But the principles found in the documents like the Geneva Conventions, if they're followed, they at least provide an opportunity for better post-war reconciliation. Memories of wartime atrocities can live on for generations, decades, if not centuries, after people who have committed them are long gone. Memorials, holidays, days of remembrance are often designed to help future generations remember what one group in war did to another. Today, for an American example, today, if you go to San Antonio, Texas, you'll find the Alamo, a surprisingly small mission, at least it was for me when I went there, this building, but this surprisingly small Spanish mission that was the site of a 13-day siege in 1836. Despite that being a relatively small battle, I mean, there were just a few hundred fighters, at least on the side of the Texas independent movement. The number of casualties, despite the regular small battle, the small number of casualties, the act of killing any of the Texas fighters who were found to be alive once the Mexican forces took the Alamo became a rallying cry for war. And it's remembered to this day, not just in San Antonio, not just in the state of Texas, but in the entire United States, even though it's been getting close to 200 years later. In some cultures, events like this are remembered thousands of years after they happen. And if fighters, if they do their best to follow Geneva Conventions, then there's always going to be difficulty. You've killed each other, you've hurt each other, you've maimed each other. It's going to be difficult bringing those sides together. But the ability to reconcile and move forward after war is much greater if you follow these basic humanitarian principles that are found in the conventions. So I'm going to sum up now and just apologize for kind of going long. I think that I recognize the Geneva Conventions have their flaws. They aren't perfect, and frankly, they never were. But they have embodied an enduring set of values and principles that we can draw on regardless of the type of conflict we find ourselves in. And even in situations where they're not technically required to be applied, they espouse, the principles they espouse, applied by analogy, can fit and assist in almost any type of conflict. And in doing so, they will let our fighting women and men, indeed our entire country, traveled through the storm that's humanity and return with your humanity intact. Traveled through the storm that is inhumanity and return with humanity intact. The first time I gave this talk on this subject, someone asked me, what do the Geneva Conventions mean to me personally? And I answered that question. I realized just how personal it was when I gave the answer. So I'll give you the answer here today. To me personally, they mean everything. Knowing that as soldiers, we followed the rules gives me peace with the things that we did in combat. Kids will ask you anything, and I have more than one kid ask me that while a soldier, did I ever kill anyone? And usually I just say no and change the subject. But what I'm thinking to myself is, how do you define killing? Have I personally shot someone or stabbed someone to death? No. Fortunately, I've never had to do that. But I have made decisions, give advice, and done things that cause the death of people either immediately or within a few days. If that's how you define killing someone, then yes, I have. And the number is in the hundreds, maybe over 1,000. And since I've been, so have I been the direct contributor of the death of people? Absolutely. And that's something I'll always have to live with. And I know that we didn't always get the answer right because war is imperfect. We killed the wrong people at times, and at other times, innocent people were killed in the process of killing the right people. In war, you always have complete information, and you have to make decisions in the moment. And I know you do your best. We did our best. But I know we followed the rules of international maritime law. We followed the Geneva Conventions. And I remember that quote, part of that quote that I read to you earlier. It said that war can give the appearances of condoning almost everything, but men must live with their actions for a long time afterwards. In truth, we all that have done that carry the weight of our actions for the rest of our lives. So what do these rules mean to me? It means that I can rest at night, that I can live with myself, that I can come home and live with the things we had to do because of IHL and Geneva Conventions. And I know my actions were moral and legal. And that means everything. So for this reason, I very much believe that the Geneva Conventions are as important today as the day they were ratified. And so I'll end there. Thank you. And if we have any time left at all, I'll be happy to address any questions you have.
Hey, Randy. Well, thank you so much for that. We do have some questions for you.
Okay.
I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but if people have questions after this event, please email us at the email address that's going to be dropped in the chat shortly. Thomas, if you could do that, that would be great. But our first question is, in many of the conflicts dominating our news today, IHL violations seem widespread and egregious. How should the public retain faith in these treaties in the face of continuing atrocities or reported atrocities?
Yeah, I won't go back over everything I said, so I'll be brief because we did touch on this. What I would say is we have to have faith that, again, they aren't designed to catch and punish every single person. But I would tell you that I think they do have a deterrent effect. Even in the worst things you see today, there are some deterrent effect. And leaders know that there could be the day where they're held accountable. So I will also go, back to the point that I made earlier that it's so easy to get lost in this thought, these negative thoughts about it when the conflict is ongoing. But if you look at history, when the conventions have worked, when these principles have worked, and there has been punishment that followed, sometimes it came years after the conflict was over. But I don't know of a single incident where enemy captured somebody else, like on the others, and we prosecuted somebody during the conflict. I do know of times where, and I say the enemy, I do know of times where countries have prosecuted their own people for violations, punished their own people for violations during the conflict. But to catch the other side, you're going to have to, which may or may not be the more egregious side, but you're going to have to wait for the conflict to be over.
All right. And our next one is kind of to the language of the Geneva Conventions. Are there current changes in the Geneva Conventions being addressed because of the rapid growth of tech or new modern methods of warfare? Or do we have to rely on the old language and translate it?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question because there's a lot of, I think everybody would like to update things. One of the places, like the Geneva Conventions are mostly about protections, so a lot of the tech argument really doesn't come in. That's much more in kind of how we fight, the weapons we use, although it could be in the conventions. But where you really see some language that needs to be updated is how the conventions address gender. And for instance, it really doesn't consider women as fighters. And even when it talks about things like sexual assault, it refers to it as like an affront to the honor of women. I mean, I don't know that we would ever use that language today. In fact, many people might find that language kind of offensive. So I just would, yeah, I think there's a lot that could be updated and it needs to be updated. The ICRC has a project where they've tried to update commentaries to the conventions so that it can modernize some of the language and some of these issues. But the reality is that we're not in a place right now where we can get the countries of the world to agree to update this. So we're kind of have what we have for this moment.
Drawing on your rich experience, what advice would you give to the next generation of legal professionals and humanitarians about upholding the values and principles of the Geneva Conventions in their work? And then on top of that, what could the average person who isn't a soldier or a lawyer do to help make sure the Geneva Conventions remain relevant?
Well, the easy one, the first one is to me is pretty easy. I would say focus on the positive about them and not the negative. So we can look at, like, again, if you wanted to look at and say, look at all these people speeding down the interstate and say, well, look, the speeding laws don't work. The speeding laws don't work. But I think if you looked at it and you said, look, all these people are going just a little over, and then occasionally you see somebody going really fast. The speeding laws do work because they are a deterrent that kind of helps it. I think we have to look at the conventions the same way and not lose heart. And then I also think that, again, I don't want to say I don't care that the other side follows them, but they have to live with what the things they did. I have to live with the things I did. I want to know that I follow the moral code that is globally accepted by every country of the world. And if I did that, then and I really followed that, then my actions, although I truly hate that I had to go down that path. I hate that I was required to do those things. I don't feel that I was immoral or illegal in doing them. And I think that's where we should take heart with the conventions. So anybody that is kind of starting this out, focus on what they do rather than what you may perceive as a failure.
All right. So I think this is going to be our last question. Let's see. How feasible do you think a world without war is? A world where conflicts aren't solved through violent and immoral means? Is there a way we can get to those standards, in your opinion?
Truthfully, no. I don't think we can. I think that I think humans are driven by power and by greed. That drives a lot of people to then do other acts. I think there are also we may see more of this driven by climate change and other aspects of the world. We see, frankly, if you're starving, you'll go into another country rather than staying in yours and dying. If your children are starving, you'll go to another country rather than let your children stay and die. And if they don't want you, you're probably willing to fight for it because we're driven to fight to stay alive. So I personally don't know that we will get to a point where humans become enlightened enough to live without power, hungry, greedy people. I don't know that we'll get to enough resources to where there won't be fights over resources. So that doesn't mean that all hope is lost. I wish we lived in a lived in a world without war. I've lost friends. I've lost good friends. I've had friends beside me die. I've seen children being, brought out of buildings that we bombed that we didn't know were there. You don't the horrors of war are the horrors of war. They're never going to go away, and I wish we could do away with them. What I do think is because that's not going to happen, or at least until the day it does, we need these rules, right? They don't prevent every innocent death. They don't prevent every bit of property destruction. They don't prevent ever atrocity, but they help and they limit it. And we're in a better place without them, with them, than we certainly would be without them. And until the day that we could get to where there's no more war, we must have this, and we must continue to rely on them and insist that people follow them, and insist that our country, our government follows them, and not go down some of the dark paths that we had in the past.
All right. Well, with that, thank you so much, Randy. We really appreciate it. We're getting lots of positive comments in the chat. A lot of people have been moved by your presentation. I want to thank you both for your service to the Red Cross and our nation, but also for being open and honest and sharing your opinion today. So thank you so much. Thank you all for coming. If you would be interested in attending any of our other future events, please go to redcross.org/IHL. The link was just put in the chat. So thank you all so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.